think that this is not a problem or something we should not be discussing. This government has remained significantly silent on this topic. We have not heard anything from this government with respect to the circumstances surrounding the end of the war. We've not heard anything from this government with respect to whether or not it's fully supportive of the decision of Ban Ki-moon to name a panel. We've not heard any response to the call from the British Prime Minister with respect to the need for war crimes investigation. I don't know why there's that reluctance, Mr. Speaker. I don't know why a government which in many respects and from insignificant moments in the life of this House has spoken clearly about democracy and has spoken clearly about human rights. I don't know why the government would have such difficulty in this particular situation. It cannot be that because there was a violent conflict and because one party to that conflict was the LTTE, it cannot be that the standard to which we hold the Sri Lankan government can be any less or any lower. It cannot be that because we have appropriately designated the LTTE as a group which practiced terror, which believed in violence, which believed in the appropriateness of killing civilians or of using civilians as targets and as shields in the course of a war, which believed it was appropriate to strap bombs on the backs of young 13-year-old women and send them into a market and send them into a bazaar. There never can be an apology or an expression of support for that kind of tactic or that kind of approach to life. We should be very clear about that. And as speaking as someone who's lost dear friends to these acts of terror, I have no hesitation in being critical of them and being critical of that. But that is never an excuse for repression. That is never an excuse for oppression. And it is not an excuse for the killing of civilians. And we would not be seeing the numbers of people that are getting on those boats if there wasn't a problem in Sri Lanka. And anybody who says that we're not worried about that, or we're not going to express a concern about that, or that's not part of what we need to discuss, is simply not facing up to the reality of the situation. So I would ask the government to use its offices of investigation and its offices in its capacity. I would like the government to remain deeply sensitive to the challenge that the Tamil community still faces in Sri Lanka, and to be aware of some of those circumstances and to be aware of the pattern of increasing the political power at the center that every sensible observer, from the International Crisis Group to Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to the United Nations itself, has been expressing concern about the underlying challenge, the problem of human rights in Sri Lanka.
If there wasn't a problem of civil rights in Sri Lanka, then we wouldn't have the refugee problem we have now. We cannot discuss this situation in the House of Commons or the proposed bill before us without speaking of the situation in Sri Lanka. We have to discuss it honestly and openly. We have to have these discussions. We have to hold this dialogue. It's essential.
Mr. Speaker, is that the government has told us, and the member who just spoke referred to it very directly, to say that the purpose of this bill is to increase the severity of punishment for what they call human smuggling. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the history of immigration and in the history of the movement of populations, it is very important for the government of Canada and for the people of Canada to express a strong view about people being paid money in order to bring many, many others to Canada and to portray them as refugees. But as my colleague has said from Etobicoke Centre, two of the most dramatic examples of the arrival of boats in this country, which the member who was asked about it simply dismissed as saying, well, that's history. Well, not exactly. Pointed out when the Komagata Naru was posted outside in Vancouver and then was not allowed in, people were not allowed to disembark, people were not allowed to stay. Eventually the boat went back, and when they went back and they arrived in India, hundreds were killed. And we know from the plight of the St. Louis that of the 900 who were not allowed to land in Havana, were not allowed to land in Miami, and were not allowed to land in Halifax, we know that of that group, probably as many as 300 were killed in the Holocaust. A lot of studies have been done on both these experiences. So when the member says, go ask your constituents how they feel, I have to say to Mr. Speaker, well, how did Canadians feel in 1914? And how did Canadians feel in 1939? And we always have to say to ourselves, these are not easy issues. And I have no doubt at all in my mind that there are a great many of my constituents who would say, if they were told about this legislation, would say, that's good. But it's only when we think it through that you have to sort of say, well, is this really what we should be doing? And that's where I have a problem. I have a problem because the law is not just about smuggling, the law is also about refugees. It creates two classes of refugees. And that's the weakness of the law, and in my view, it's the flaw of the law, and in my view, it's a flaw which the courts will attack front and center. Front and center because it's not just about the Charter, it's also about our international obligations. We have signed covenants with respect to the rights of children and with respect to the rights of refugees. We cannot simply say that because you came over in this boat, we will put you in a different category, you will be designated by the minister, and you will not be able to do what other refugees can do or what other people who are applying for refugee status can do or who are seeking to be refugees can do. And it's this creation of two classes which is the central weakness and flaw of the bill, in addition to the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the legislation as a whole and the discussion as a whole does not deal, in fact, with the problem where it lies. Now, it is equally important for us, Mr. Speaker, to deal with one other issue, and that is the issue of queue jumping. Because there's nothing more, I think, basic to a Canadian sense of fairness than to say that we don't want people jumping the queue, that is to say, trying to come in as immigrants when there are other people who are patiently waiting in their countries of origin. But it has to be understood, there is no queue line for refugees. There is no queue line. These are two different things. And that's where, again, I think the government has used language, quite creatively, I might add, which is intended to say to Canadians, we've got to create a situation which is fair to everyone. And I agree, we have to create a situation which is fair to everyone. But I, for one, question legislation which creates two separate categories of refugees, treats people who come over in certain boats in a certain way, and people who come over by plane or in another boat in another way. And I think the government is not being upfront with the people of Canada when it suggests that what is taking place is any form of queue jumping. If there's a refugee process that's well managed and that has enough people there to manage the flow of people who are coming in and asking to be refugees, if you're not accepted as a refugee, you go